We're beginning Chapter 14 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. Green Berets. The Special Forces A-Team camp at Tan Tri was located in Cain Thuong Province in the Mekong Delta, strategically positioned just 3 miles from Vietnam's border with Cambodia. What happened there in the summer of 1969 would become an international scandal known as the Green Beret Affair, a tragic conundrum that would raise complex questions about murder versus assassination, about the mysterious relationship between the CIA and the Green Berets, and about the laws of war. Most important to this story, the Green Berets Affair of 1969 demonstrates how the construct of plausible deniability shields the U.S. president from wrongdoing while exposing operators who carry out euphemistic orders vulnerable to prosecution and jail time. As per the terms of the 1954 Geneva Conference in Indochina, fighting in Cambodia was prohibited. By 1967, intelligence indicated that the communists had expanded to Ho Chi Minh Trail down into Cambodia, to a terminus point on the border just 30 miles from Saigon called Berets. Starting in the spring of that same year, I try to get this acronym right, Military Assistance Command Viet Cong, or Vehicle, Special Operators Group began running secret cross-border operations into Cambodia under the code name Daniel Boone. Detaching B-57s of the 5th Special Forces Airborne at Tan Tri provided intelligence for those and other missions under the CIA code name Project Gamma. Like so many other Green Beret paramilitary units across Vietnam, the one at Tan Tri was a hybrid of Special Forces soldiers, CIA personnel, and local indigenous soldiers. Detachment B-57 was made up of 6 Green Berets, 3 CIA operators, and as many as 450 indigenous fighters. This unit was commanded by one of the CIA's operators, a 27-year-old former insurance salesman named Robert F. Marasco. He went by the cover name Captain Martin. By the winter of 1968 through 69, Marasco had assembled a network of 28 indigenous assets who spied for him around the Berets. His most valuable spy, called a principal asset, was a 31-year-old native of the north named Tai Kak Chuin. Chuin's official position was S5 interpreter, or TERP in military speak. Chuin had been recruited by CIA case officer Sergeant Alvin Smith Jr., who went by the cover name Peter Sands, and who reported to Marasco in Tan Tri. Smith was an enigmatic CIA case officer, older than Marasco by 15 years. He was also a veteran of unconventional warfare, having led covert operations behind enemy lines in Korea. According to his file, Alvin Smith once served as the only American in a battalion of 1,400 Korean and Chinese indigenous troops as part of a JAC mission that had never been fully declassified. For better or for worse, Alvin Smith was known for becoming friendly with his assets. At the nearby support base at Ma Qua, he'd sometimes stay up late into the night, drinking whiskey with Chuin. How Chuin spoke such good English irked Smith. Chuin said he grew up reading books in English, and that he'd worked for the U.S. military in Saigon. When pressed, Chuin was vague about the details, claiming the missions were all classified. Now it was March 1969, and there'd been an unusual number of mortar attacks on Ma Kwa, an indicator that a bigger attack might be coming. Marasco sent a unit out on a recon mission led by a Green Beret from Kentucky named Terry McIntosh, just 19 at a time. McIntosh was one of the youngest Green Berets assigned to the war. He'd already been in Vietnam for 7 months. It was me, Chuan, and 10 indigenous troops on the mission. McIntosh recalled in an interview for this book, a little before dawn, I spotted enemy movement along the tree line, indicating an ambush. McIntosh fired a grenade launcher in the direction of the troops and watched the fighters disperse. He handed the scope off to Chuan. He looked through it. I remember that he smiled. I thought that was strange, but dismissed it, remembers McIntosh, who then tried calling the A camp for support, but the radio was dead. Ground to comms were usually excellent out here, he recalls. That radio didn't work was strange to him. Suddenly, a volley of fire erupted from all sides, as if the Viet Cong had foreknowledge that the team was coming, says McIntosh. A massive firefight ensued, with McIntosh firing his assault rifle until he was out of ammunition. Chuan was on my left and the others to my right, but I noticed that Chuan wasn't firing his weapon, he remembers. He was fiddling with it, and later claimed that it jammed. At the time, I accepted his explanation without reservation. Back at A camp, the commander heard artillery fire and ordered a mortar attack based on the unit's last known position. The firefight ended without any fatalities from Detachment B-57, and the men returned to Than 3 McIntosh. The men returned to Tan 3. McIntosh, a radio specialist and a teammate, examined the gear. It had been tampered with, McIntosh recalls. He told Marasco, who became concerned. One of Marasco's other assets told him he'd heard Chuan was a communist spy. Marasco ran a search, and in the MACV database, but there was no record of Chuan. As a CIA employee, Marasco had access to classified information that others did not. That no record on Chuan appeared likely meant that he was lying about having ever worked on classified missions in Saigon. Fearing he was a double agent, Marasco radioed headquarters at Nha Trang and asked about both men, Smith and Chuan, be reassigned. Smith was moved over to the 5th Special Forces headquarters, and Chuan returned to Saigon, where his family lived. A few weeks later, Special Forces Recon Team recovered photographs of a high-level North Vietnamese Army general meeting with his local Viet Cong spies. In one of the photographs, there was Chuan, standing next to the North Vietnamese general, smiling. Robert Marasco was sure it was Chuan. Alvin Smith was also shown the photograph and had the same response. It was Chuan. Their principal asset was a spy for the North. On June 9th, CIA headquarters instructed Alvin Smith to bring Chuan in, under the disguise of a covert operation. For 5 days, Chuan was interrogated. He repeatedly failed the polygraph, all the while insisting the person in the photograph was not him. The transcript of what he actually said has never been declassified. But according to reports leaked to the press, he cursed the Americans and said they'd lose the war to the communists in the North. What to do with Double Agent Chuan? He couldn't be sent to local law enforcement. The police around Perek's Beak were notoriously corrupt and rife with double agents. Chewin knew the identities of all the undercover CIA officers, operators, and assets at Tan 3. Alvin Smith suggested they'd try to turn Chewin into a triple agent, someone who could work for the CIA again. Marasco contacted the CIA station at Nha Trang and asked what he should do. He was told to kill him. Chewin was my agent, and it was my responsibility to eliminate him with extreme prejudice, Marasco later told the New York Times. Marasco said, "These were oblique yet very clear orders." He explained further that everyone working covert operations for the CIA and Special Forces knew that the phrase "eliminate with extreme prejudice" was a euphemism for kill. Marasco reached out to the commander of the U.S. Army Special Forces, Colonel Robert B. Ruholt, asking for his orders on the matter. Colonel Ruholt told Marasco that the group was to proceed. The CIA officers and U.S. Army Green Berets agreed on a cover story. They'd say Chewin has been assigned to a covert mission and then disappeared. Everyone involved proceeded, except Alvin Smith, who refused to participate. Agent Chewin was told he was needed for a highly classified mission. On June 20th, 1969, the CIA officer and Green Berets drugged Chewin with morphine, drove with him to a remote beach near Nha Trang, and loaded him into a boat. They took the boat out into the deep waters at Nha Trang Bay, where Marasco shot Chewin in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, equipped with a suppressor while Chewin was still unconscious. Damn, that just happened. Anyways, the men loaded Chewin's body into a mail sack, weighed it down with chains and tire rims, and threw him overboard into the South China Sea. The following day, a cable came in from CIA headquarters. "Killing is no solution," it read. Paranoia gripped CIA case officer Alvin Smith. He went to his CIA superior in Nha Trang and asked for asylum in exchange for information. With immunity in place, he told his superior officer that his colleague at Ta 3 killed Chewin, and that now Smith feared for his own life. Things moved fast. The CIA officer notified the U.S. Army, which sent the information up the chain of command, all the way to U.S. Commander in Vietnam, General Creighton Abrams, Jr. General Abrams summoned Colonel Ruholt to his office and asked what happened to Chewin. Ruholt told the general that the asset was away on a secret mission, when in fact he'd already been killed. When General Abrams learned that he'd been lied to, he exploded with rage. The following day, Colonel Ruholt, Robert Marasco, and 6 Green Berets were arrested, handcuffed, and sent to Long Binh Jail outside Saigon. They'd been tried for conspiracy to commit murder and murder in the first degree, Abrams said. The military imposed a gag order on those who knew about the case, but reporters quickly learned of the arrest and details of their imprisonment. That American Green Berets were being held in solitary confinement in tiny 5x7 cells with just a cot and a bare light bulb seemed outrageous. How could the U.S. Army treat its own soldiers like this? Most shocking of all, the Secretary of the Army said that if men were convicted, their punishment would be life in prison, not a firing squad. Firing squad? The press cried. Absurd. Despite the growing anti-war movement across America, the majority of civilians sided with the Green Berets, calling them scapegoats of the Pentagon war machine. More mysterious details emerged. Double agents, triple agents, Green Berets, the CIA. Then came the rumor that the Green Berets were operating across the border in Cambodia. This at a time when the Nixon White House had already insisted that a New York Times reporter who'd revealed that the United States was dropping bombs on Cambodia was a liar. When someone leaked to the press the photograph of Chuen standing next to the North Vietnamese Army general, smiling citizens and congressmen alike began to ask questions. How could killing a Viet Cong spy in a war zone be considered a war crime? Life magazine interviewed Colonel Ruholt's 11-year-old son, Robert Jr. What's all the fuss about? Asked the fifth grader. I thought that's what Dad was in Vietnam for, to kill the Viet Cong. Henry Rothblatt, defense attorney for the Green Berets, made a brilliant move. He deposed the CIA. Marasco's identity as CIA officer remained classified. Marasco revealed his identity to the New York Times in 1971. Rothblatt was betting that there was no way the White House would allow the CIA to testify in court. Between its ongoing assassination programs, the Phoenix program, the classified MACV Special Observation Group missions into Laos and Cambodia, these were but a few of the president's hidden hand programs that surely needed to remain that way. The president's inner circle would never allow the CIA to testify about its operations in Vietnam. The White House had far too much to lose. Yeah. President Nixon had a last-minute idea, a double cross of CIA Director Richard Helms, whom Nixon disliked. In a note to Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, Nixon wrote, "Kay, I think Richard Helms should be made to take part of the rap." While there is no record of Kissinger's reaction, based on actions taken, it is likely he advised the president against throwing Helms under the proverbial bus. Instead, the following morning, on September 29th, 1969, the U.S. Army unexpectedly dropped all charges against the 8 men involved in the Green Berets affair. The U.S. Department of Justice concluded that a fair and impartial trial was not possible. Further details of the CIA's refusal to testify remain classified. But under pressure, the Nixon White House was forced to acknowledge that the president had been involved in the decision to drop all murder charges. Decades later, after MACV Special Observation Group was declassified, a fascinating detail emerged. On August 25th, a month after the CIA officers and Green Berets were arrested, but before Nixon White House dropped the murder charges, a Special Observation Group recon team called RT Florida was sent on a top-secret cross-border mission into Cambodia. There, the team was pursued by a squadron of North Vietnamese Army soldiers, using dogs to track them. In the process of evading capture, the Special Observation Group operators shot and killed 2 North Vietnamese Army officers. One of the dead men turned out to be a high-ranking intelligence officer. Inside the large leather satchel he carried was a gold mine, a cache of documents, one of which was a partial roster of double agents and spies operating for Hanoi inside South Vietnam. One name on the roster was the double agent executed by orders of Colonel Ruholt, writes scholar Richard Schultz. War is never pleasant, says Terry McIntosh. War is bigger than the individual soldier. For the record, as tragic as it was for all parties, I salute Moscow and others who were charged. They were soldiers under orders. There was no good options for them. The job fell to them. The moral issues are still unresolved. Yeah, they did their job, but they gotta go away anyways. It was into this highly charged environment that a young Green Beret named Louis C. Merletti volunteered to go to Vietnam. Lou Merletti stood in the green grass on the side of Interstate 95 North in Fayetteville, North Carolina, with his thumb out. It was 1969. He was 21 years old and knew he was hitching a ride to the Pentagon to volunteer for service in Vietnam. His whole life was in front of him, including his plans, dreams, and aspirations of doing great things for himself, his family, and his country. But he also felt he could not do any of this good in conscience if he skipped out on Vietnam. This war going on, and I knew a lot of guys my age that were being drafted, and I didn't want to go, and they were going anyway, recalls Merletti. I really felt like, hey, it's not right. I have to contribute to this, and I can't be sitting back here safe in the United States if these guys are going over there fighting this war. It just didn't seem to me to be fair. In 1969, young Lou Merletti had no way of knowing what his immediate future included. He certainly had no idea that one day he would serve on the Presidential Protective Detail of 3 U.S. presidents, or that he would become the 19th director of the U.S. Secret Service, a law enforcement agency created by President Abraham Lincoln and signed into law on the morning of April 14th, 1865, the day of Lincoln's own assassination. Go figure. The journey to war for Lou Merletti began 2 years earlier, when he signed up for military service as an airborne infantryman at the end of his first week of jump school. A very confident, very focused, physically fit young man showed up in full military dress to speak to Merletti's group of roughly 300 soldiers in training. The man wore the green beret. He gets up on this platform in front of us and says, "Gentlemen, I'm going to be honest with you. Special Forces is losing men and we need volunteers." Merletti recalls he volunteered. Training lasted 42 weeks. You learn how to treat gunshot wounds, perform surgeries and amputations. It's basically like becoming a highly trained paramedic, Merletti explains. The U.S. Army Special Forces also wanted some of its medics to speak Vietnamese. They would be treating a lot of citizens in country, and so Merletti was sent to the language school at Fort Bragg. Over the course of the next 5 months, for 8 hours a day, He was taught Vietnamese by a lively young woman originally from North Vietnam. By the time he finished training, he had less than 1 year on his 30-year enlistment. I was told I didn't have to go to Vietnam, he remembers. It was too close to the end of his tour. Unless I volunteered. This is why he was hitchhiking to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., that spring day in 1969. Merletti had been standing on the side of the road in full dress uniform with his green beret for about 5 minutes when a man in a Volkswagen Bug pulled up, slowed to a stop, and rolled down the window. "Where are you going?" the man asked. "The Pentagon," Merletti said. It was the height of Vietnam War. It was the height of the Vietnam War. It was also the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. The country was terribly divided. Lou Merletti had a feeling that the outcome here, with the driver of the VW Bug, could go either way. "The Pentagon? Are you kidding me?" the man asked, incredulous. Lou said he was not kidding, that he was going there to volunteer for combat service in Vietnam. "Well, if you're going to the Pentagon," the driver said, "I'll take you straight there." And he did. Nearly 50 years later, Berletti vividly remembers being dropped off in the parking lot of the Pentagon, and he still thinks about the anonymous man who drove him there. The man's willingness to help do his part, however incremental. There in Washington, D.C., inside Defense Department headquarters, Merletti located Mrs. Billy Alexander, just as Billy Waugh had sought out and found Mrs. Alexander when he wanted to get assigned to Special Observation Group. Everybody knew Billy Alexander was in charge of assigning volunteers to special forces in Vietnam, remembers Merletti. And as she had for so many others, she approved his request. "You'll be in Vietnam in August," she said. To get to Vietnam, Merletti first flew from his hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Chicago, Illinois, where he had a layover. He traveled in his Class A dress uniform and green beret. He really stood out as a soldier back then, Merletti calls. No one else in the entire military was authorized to wear a beret. That was only the Green Beret. Then, to his surprise, as he approached the gate, Merletti spotted a fellow Green Beret. But it wasn't just anyone. It was his very good friend from Special Forces training, 7th Group Mike Karupas. He was saying goodbye to his family. So I kind of held back, he remembers. Eventually, Mike Karupas spotted Merletti and introduced him to his family, a group of whom had come to the airport to see him off to war. "I met everybody, and then it was time to get on the plane," recalls Merletti, to go fight the war in Vietnam. On the airplane, a strange thing happened. Merletti and Karupas were sitting together in the front of the plane. The flight attendants began to serve lunch, Merletti recalls. They put a meal in front of me, and then they said to Mike, "We'll get you a meal in a minute." 5 or so minutes passed before the flight attendant returned. She says, "We're really sorry, but we don't have any meals left. But here's a little voucher, so the next time you fly, you'll get an upgrade or something like that." Mike Karupas looked at the voucher. He looks at me, remembers Merletti, and he says, "You know this is a bad omen." And I say, "What do you mean?" He says, "I'm not coming back." I say, "Mike, don't say that. Don't say that at all," I said. "You know We all have those thoughts. But don't go there. Just don't do it. Mike Krupas looked squarely at Lou Merletti and said, "No, I know I'm not coming back." When they arrived in the country, Merletti, Krupas, and the rest of the Green Berets were taken to the island facility on Han Tri, off the coast of Vietnam. There, Special Forces soldiers coming from the United States for insertion into the battlefield generally spent several days getting a refresher course in shooting, using hand grenades, setting off claymore mines, and using of mortars. When the training on Han Tri was over, the group traveled to Special Forces headquarters in Nha Trang. They tell us, "Okay, everybody, fall out. You have your orders." We lined up and were standing at attention, and they begin calling names off and telling you where you're going. Merletti heard the sergeant by his name, Merletti A502. This meant he'd been assigned to Detachment A502 of the 5th Special Forces Group. The detachment's mission was to advise and assist the Vietnamese Special Forces in the joint CIA-Pentagon program, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. Lou Merletti remembers thinking to himself, "Hey, that's not a bad assignment." Then he heard Mike Krupas' name being called out, and the assignment he'd been given. Krupas, CCC. Merletti remembers thinking to himself, "Oh God." Everyone knew that CCC was part of MACV Special Observation Group. The acronym CCC stood for Command and Control Center, one of what were now 3 Special Observation Group bases in South Vietnam. Special Forces soldiers who were new to the program knew Special Observation Group was the place where hardcore warriors with extensive combat experience fought direct action missions behind enemy lines. Special Observation Group was where Special Forces legends like Larry Thorne, Ed Wolkoff, and Billy Waugh fought and thrived. Some until they died. But for newcomers, for initiates into combat, Special Observation Group was dangerous. It was suicide on the ground. Merletti tried to make light of Krupas' assignment, but found the reality of the situation difficult to accept. "I volunteered for Vietnam," he recalls. "I don't think Mike Krupas had. I believe he'd received orders to go. I knew he didn't want to go to Special Observation Group, to Central Command Center," remembers Merletti, "but I knew he'd give it his best." The sergeant in charge announced that helicopters would be arriving momentarily to take everyone to their specific destinations. "The formation breaks up," says Merletti, and Mike, who was standing maybe 2 people down from me, he steps over and he put out his hand and he says, "Hey, thank you for your friendship and everything. It's been wonderful," he said. "I really appreciate you for being my friend, but this is it. It's over." And I said, "Please, Mike, don't say that." And he says, No. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. It's all right." Lou Merletti got on one Army helicopter and Mike Krupas got on another Army helicopter. Either right before the birds flew away or as they were taking off, Merletti either said out loud to Mike Krupas or said to himself, "No, I'll meet you back here in 1 year." Lou Merletti was sent to a small village called Trong Dong in the Central Highlands, a remote area at risk of being dominated by the Viet Cong. He lived in a Special Forces A camp there, built earlier by Green Berets. His team consisted of 12 Americans and a unit of indigenous mercenaries called Civilian Irregular Defense Group Strikers. being paid by the Department of Defense to defend their village and to stop the enemy from gaining further control into the area. I had not been exposed to combat, Merletti remembers, and on the very first night, there was an ambush. In the ensuing firefight, 6 Viet Cong were killed, and one of the mercenaries was bitten by a poisonous snake, which Merletti treated in the field before having the man medevaced out, thanks to the guidance, he says, of teammate Sergeant John DeCamps. Some weeks later, he and the team were out on patrol in the dense jungle where the civilian irregular defense group striker standing right next to him was shot in the head. My immediate reaction, says Merletti, was, I've got to help. Then I realized I was the help. After a few intense and shock-riddled moments, Merletti's Special Forces medical training kicked in. I knew exactly what to do, he recalls. I said to myself, I can do this. I was trained for this. And he did. He stopped the bleeding, wrapped the wound, and again oversaw the medevac. For the better part of a year, Merletti served in combat as part of the Special Forces A team. Every time you go out on patrol, you have a lump in your throat, he recalls. You wonder, is this it? Every footstep you take, you know it could be your last footstep. To stay focused and not let his mind wander. When he went out on patrol, Merletti learned to pay attention to minute details. Every detail mattered. If he wasn't paying attention, he could cross a tripwire and step on a landmine or make a noise that might alert the enemy. You couldn't let your mind drift. You couldn't think, man, I wish I were at a ballpark. I wish I had a cold lemonade or a beer in my hand. Do that and you're dead. You learn to look at the ground in front of you, to look at your flank. Pay attention to every single detail, every moment of every day. Yeah. Merletti's one-year tour of duty was scheduled to come to an end on May 30th, 1970. But in the spring of 1970, the Defense Department announced it was reducing troop numbers in Vietnam at President Nixon's request, and all soldiers were being given what was called a 30-day drop. And so, in the first week of April 1970, Lou Merletti learned he was scheduled to leave Vietnam on April 28th. All across Vietnam, Green Berets received the same news, and that included Mike Krupas, who for 10 straight months had been fighting intense direct action missions on a recon team for Special Observation Group Central Command Center. On the morning of April 15th, 1970, trouble began near Special Forces A camp at Dak Sang, in the Central Highlands, 10 miles from the border with Laos. The intelligence showed a massive buildup of North Vietnamese Army forces underway, positioned to overtake the camp and surrounding valley. The plan was to insert a battalion of Special Forces soldiers and their South Vietnamese Army counterparts on top of the mountains to protect the camp and all it stood for. One of the soldiers who fought there described this hilltop as little more than a bald knob with craters, but it was a strategic position. With a vantage point over the surrounding valley, the U.S. Army and the North Vietnamese Army each wanted to control it. The designated LZ Orange, the Defense Department would initiate an offensive move to control it. So it was at 04:30 in the morning of April 15th. The flight line at Khartoum Airfield came alive with pilots, crew chiefs, and gunners busying themselves with their pre-flight checks, mounting weapons and loading rocket pods, recalled Donald Summers, a member of the 170th Assault Helicopter Company. He was about to be inserted as the sun rose and the offensive began. As at Oscar 8 helicopter gunships cleared LZ Orange, while 2 troop transport helicopters ferried in South Vietnamese soldiers and their U.S. Special Forces commanders. The first helicopter landed, and its crew charged out. Then, in a move perfected by the North Vietnamese Army, the second helicopter hovered 50 feet over the landing zone. It was rocketed out of the air, killing 9 of the 12 men on board. On the ground, there were 8 South Vietnamese soldiers and 5 American soldiers who survived, including 1 pilot, 1 co-pilot, 1 door gunner, a pathfinder, and the crew chief. U.S. Air Force's fast flyers came in screeching overhead, laying down suppressive fire. Over the past several hours, the losses in the area had been staggering. 4 helicopters shot down, 7 helicopters hit, fate unknown. One of the A-1E Sky Raiders was last seen losing altitude above a ridgeline, its engine on fire. It was at this point in the operation that the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force Command assessed the operation from headquarters and decided a rescue mission was not possible without an unacceptable further loss of life. Which is when a Special Observation Group Bright Light team operating out of Kontum was asked to volunteer for a rescue mission. Like firefighters running into a burning building, Staff Sergeant Mike Krupas, Staff Sergeant Dennis Neal, and 6 Montagnard mercenaries volunteered for the job. The operation plan was to insert the Bright Light team into the LZ Orange to rescue the men trapped on the hill. Bill McDonald of the 170th Assault Helicopter Company volunteered to pilot the team into the targeted area, straight into poison. Helicopter pilot Donald Summers was one of the men bleeding out and dying on the hill. He later recalled seeing the helicopter carrying the Special Observation Group Bright Light team on its approach, roughly half a mile out from the landing zone. Pilot Bill McDonald dropped his Special Observation Group helicopter into a deep dive and headed down the valley floor. He had to fly in low and fast, up the side of the mountains to the LZ landing zone. Summers recalled, or he would have been shot down long before he got anywhere near the hill. He was taking extensive fire from 360 degrees, but he pressed on, crippled from enemy gunfire, but still flying. Summers watched, horrified. The bird slammed into the landing zone. Fuel poured out of a large hole in the fuel cell. A rocket had been lodged near the tail, but not exploded. Under a barrage of small arms fire, Summers and the other survivor ran toward the helicopter. Summers remembered reaching the aircraft and looking inside. There, Special Observation Group Bright Light Team leader Mike Krupas, Dennis Neal, and the 6 Montagnards lay dead on the floor, shredded from multiple gunshot wounds. Summers climbed into the crippled helicopter, and by some strange aviation miracle, Bill McDonald was able to fly the helicopter away. 13 days later, on April 28th, Lou Merletti completed his service in Vietnam. He was helicoptered down from the A-Team camp at Trong Dong to Special Forces headquarters in Nha Trang. The first action he took was to walk up to the bulletin board and search for Mike Krupas's name. He found it. It read, Michael Vincent Krupas, killed in action, April 15th, 1970. Merletti felt a crushing loss. Standing there, I became overwhelmed with emotion, he recalls. The reality set in. I thought about Mike, and I still think about all the guys who died in Vietnam. Each one of them. They were alive one moment, and they got shot. There's no anesthesia on the battlefield. You get shot, it's incredibly painful to get shot. You bleed out before you die, Berets says, standing in front of Mike Krupas's name. Berets made a vow. I wanted to try to live up to certain expectations of myself. For him, for Mike. Berets vowed that moving forward in his life, were he to perceive something in front of himself as difficult, he would stop and think of Mike Krupas. He would later acknowledge that whatever problem he was having the problem because he was alive. Mike Krupas would not have the luxury of problems. Mike Krupas, age just 22, was dead. By the end of 1970, the war was all but lost. The human losses too great to bear. The mighty U.S. Defense Department could not win the war. There were no front lines. The enemy swarmed like bees, like ants crawling or fish swimming, just as Mao Zedong warned in guerrilla warfare, and General Giap had echoed in his own manifesto. The communists dominated the geography of every environment. For much of the war, the Defense Department believed its helicopters could tip the balance of power. But by 1971, helicopter losses were insurmountable, too. The precise number of helicopters shot down during the Vietnam War remains classified as of 2019. It's probably the GDP of a small nation, maybe more. Still, the Defense Department was not ready to accept their loss, just like a gambler. And the several 11th hour attempts were made within Special Observation Group before 1971 to develop new tactics to win a guerrilla war. Billy Waugh was at the locus of one of these new ideas, insertion by parachute in an unorthodox manner. It was called a halo jump. This involved exiting an aircraft above 10,000 feet, free falling to roughly 2,000 feet or even lower, and then gliding to the earth using a steerable parachute. During the Korean War, General Jak-sing Laub had practiced this tactic himself as a possible insertion technique to use in the covert air operations he was in charge of for the CIA. But the tactic was never used in Korea. In 1970, the halo jump remained untested in war. Since World War II, paratroopers had always jumped into battle using static lines that would open the parachutes automatically, predictably, one after the next, so a large group of jumpers could land in a pattern or a drop zone. Vietnam was different. Special Observation Group recon teams knew the North Vietnamese Army didn't keep watch over landing zones at night because no one ever parachuted in the darkness, until now. Waugh was in charge of selecting the world's first combat halo team, then overseeing all Special Observation halo training, including of the Indig fighters assigned to operations. The units practiced on a tiny isle just a few miles off the northwest coast of Okinawa called the Leshima Island. There, Special Observation Group practiced jumping out of aircraft at 30,000 feet in full combat gear, and then performing a military freefall for 27,500 feet, reaching terminal velocity before pulling the ripcord and landing in the ocean. The attempt to train their Indig counterparts was a tall order, remembers Waugh. The Green Berets were all airborne qualified. Some, like Waugh, had been jumping out of airplanes for more than 20 years. None of the Indigs had ever left Vietnam, let alone jumped out of an airplane with a parachute. Half of our indigs had never seen the ocean before, recalls Waugh. One of our guys got spooked and pulled his parachute right after he jumped. He missed the target by about 10 miles. By the time we got to him in the rescue boat, he'd already consumed about a gallon of seawater. He got very sick. On November 28, 1970, Special Observation Group's 1st Halo Team, Recon Team Florida, jumped into Laos. The unit was led by Staff Sergeant Cliff Newman, Sergeant First Class Sammy Hernandez, and Sergeant First Class Melvin Hill, accompanied by an officer with the South Vietnamese Army and 2 Montagnard mercenaries who had no experience jumping but did just fine, remembers Waugh. Reconnaissance Team Virginia conducted 5 days of reconnaissance behind enemy lines and were exfiltrated out without incident. This was the first known Halo combat jump in the history of warfare. 7 months later, on June 22, 1961, Billy Waugh led the 3rd Halo jump team into combat, also in Laos. Teammate Madison Strohein was captured and killed. The vertical wind tunnel at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at school at Fort Bragg was named in his honor. But no amount of new thinking and no number of unusual infiltration tactics could salvage this unwinnable war. The following year, on May 1st, 1972, Special Observation Group was disbanded. American citizens were fed up with violence and warfare. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, bringing an end to the Vietnam War, with the country to remain divided between North and the South. With 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam, guerrilla warfare was a dirty word. Across the military and intelligence communities, budgets were slashed. Across the CIA, the Defense Department covert action programs were disbanded. The U.S. Army in general, and the U.S. Special Operations Forces in particular, suffered a black eye. 4 of the Army's 6 Special Forces groups were inactivated. The 2 small units that remained were assigned to a program called Spartan, Special Proficiency and Rugged Training and Nation Building. To stay active, its soldiers worked with Indian tribes in Florida, Arizona, and Montana, helping to build roads and medical facilities. The U.S. Army vowed to concentrate on conventional warfare, to stay out of ungovernable places like the jungles of Southeast Asia, and to instead prepare for infantry and tank warfare on the flatlands of Central Europe. Like Billy Waugh and the skills they possessed, they were not needed by the U.S. military or intelligence services anymore. The Army offered Waugh a desk job at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Waugh knew, after more than 10 years of covert action and direct action combat operations, that office work was not for him. In lieu of a retirement ceremony, he had 6 Green Beret Halo jumped out of an aircraft over Fort Bragg, pulling their parachutes 800 feet above parade grounds. They landed, packed up their parachutes, and spent the afternoon drinking beer in honor of their dead friends. Then they went home. 800 feet. Back from Vietnam, Lou Merletti enrolled at Dunsk University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He would earn his four-year degree in a little over 3 years. One day before he graduated, he was walking through the student center when he caught sight of a notice on a bulletin board. NSA hiring. The notice read, he took the test being offered to new recruits, aced it, and was called in for interview. Inside the foyer of a fancy building, he followed instructions that took him up an elevator to the 35th floor. I walked around. There didn't seem to be anyone in any of the offices, but eventually I located the correct room, Berets recalls. Seated behind a desk was a man. After some small talk, the man spoke candidly. "We're an intelligence gathering agency," he said. "We're larger than the CIA. We want to offer you a job." Berets asked why the NSA, an intelligence agency, was interested in recruiting him, a former Green Beret. After an exchange of words, I realized the recruiter was interested in my language capabilities, that I spoke Vietnamese. The man told Merletti that if he were to work for the NSA, it would be a solid career, but a job with an intelligence agency was not what Lou Merletti had in mind for the future. The war was over, he remembered thinking. How long were we going to be spying on the Vietnamese? Merletti told the recruiter that he was interested in finding a long-term and fulfilling career. The NSA recruiter asked Merletti what it is he wanted to do. "I feel that I'm really good at protecting people and saving lives," Merletti recalls telling them. "That's what I'd like to do." "You should join the Secret Service," the man said. Lou Merletti had never considered a career with the U.S. Secret Service, but it made sense. He had the skills of a Special Forces soldier and the heart and soul of a protector. After 2 interviews with the Secret Service, he was hired. He thought about how awesome it felt to work for the agency that protected the President of the United States. The assassination was as old as warfare and would never go away. For Billy Waugh, the transition to a civilian career was not easy. In need of a paycheck, he took a job at one of the few federal institutions that was hiring combat veterans without prejudice, the U.S. Postal Service. In the fall of 1972, he reported for duty at a post office in Austin, Texas, 20 miles from where he was born. Waugh rose up through the ranks. With the discipline of a Green Beret and the desire to excel, he moved from mail carrier to the person who oversaw the automated mail sorting machine. "Let's face it," recalls Waugh, "for a person like me, post office work was worse than death." Billy Waugh was 43. He'd spent 25 years of his life as a soldier, half of them in combat. And in an interview in 2017, he'd shared a rare emotional moment about what he was thinking at that time. "I do not ever recall feeling fear, not at that moment in my life, not in combat before, and not anywhere since. But there in the post office, I feared my life was over," he remembers, "that I would wind up some old man drinking at the end of the bar." For 5 long years, Billy Waugh continued to work for the Postal Service, until one night in July 1977, the telephone rang. He answered it and recognized the voice on the other end of the line. It belonged to covert action operator it belonged to a covert action operator he worked with in Special Observation Group in Vietnam. The man asked Billy if he was ready for action, if he wanted back in. Waugh said yes. Let's see, we got a bunch of pictures and stuff. I'm pretty sure that's the end of that chapter. Yep, that's the end of the chapter. Until next time.